James Chen sat in his home office, staring at the email that confirmed his appointment as the new CEO of Sterling Technologies. The company was struggling, not with its products, but with its culture. Employee turnover was high, and anonymous reviews painted a picture of a toxic workplace. Instead of walking in with a briefcase and a corner office on day one, James had a different plan. Over dinner that evening, his wife looked concerned when he shared his idea. "You want to do what?" she asked, nearly dropping her fork. James explained his plan to work as a janitor for 2 weeks before taking his position. "I need to see the real company, not the polished version they show a CEO," he said, pushing his glasses up his nose. The next morning, James met with Rita, the head of HR, in a small coffee shop far from the office. She was the only person who would know his true identity. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, sliding him the maintenance staff paperwork. James nodded, signing his temporary employment contract under the name Jim Lee. That night, James stood in front of his bathroom mirror, practicing his new persona. He replaced his designer watch with a simple digital one, swapped his contact lenses for old glasses, and messed up his usually neat hair. His reflection showed a different person, exactly what he wanted. His first night at Sterling Technologies started at 11 p.m. The security guard barely glanced at his ID badge, waving him through to the maintenance room. The supervisor, Mr. Thompson, handed him cleaning supplies and a map of his assigned floors. "Don't bother the office people if they're working late," he said gruffly. "They don't like being disturbed." As James pushed his cleaning cart through the quiet hallways, he noticed small things that spoke volumes. Trash deliberately left beside empty bins. Coffee spills that had clearly been walked through, spreading the mess further. Snack wrappers stuffed between couch cushions in the break room. Around 1 a.m., he encountered his first late-working employees. 3 men in expensive suits were leaving a conference room. One of them looked directly at James and smirked. "Hey, new guy," he called out. "We had a little accident with some coffee in there. Make sure you get it all, okay?" His friends laughed as they walked away, and James discovered they had deliberately knocked over multiple cups, creating a massive mess. That first night was eye-opening. James heard snippets of conversations as he cleaned, complaints about lower-level employees, jokes about the cleaning staff's broken English, plans to cut benefits while increasing executive bonuses. He kept his head down, playing the role perfectly, but his heart raced with every new discovery. Back home at 7 a.m., James couldn't sleep despite his exhaustion. He sat at his kitchen table, making detailed notes about everything he'd seen and heard. His wife brought him coffee and listened as he described the night. "I knew there were problems," he said, rubbing his tired eyes, "but seeing it firsthand, it's worse than I imagined." The building's night shift showed him a completely different side of Sterling Technologies. It wasn't just about the mess or the extra work, it was about dignity. The way some employees looked through the maintenance staff as if they were invisible. The casual cruelty in their comments. The deliberate actions that made others' jobs harder just because they could. As he finally drifted off to sleep that morning, James knew this undercover mission would change more than just his understanding of the company. It would change everything about how Sterling Technologies operated. But first, he had to survive 13 more nights of seeing his future employees at their unfiltered worst. This was just the beginning of a journey that would shake Sterling Technologies to its core. James didn't know it yet, but his decision to start at the bottom would lead to one of the most dramatic workplace transformations in recent memory. The second week at Sterling Technologies started differently for James. He now knew the building's layout by heart and had mastered the art of becoming invisible when late-working employees were around. But tonight, something felt different. The usual weight of his cleaning cart seemed heavier, perhaps because he knew what he would likely witness. Around midnight, he was mopping near the finance department when he overheard 2 managers talking in the break room. "Can you believe they hired another cleaner who can barely speak English?" one said, not realizing James could understand every word perfectly. "I mean, how hard is it to find people who can at least take proper directions?" James gripped his mop tighter but kept working. He'd learned that the night shift revealed people's true colors, especially when they thought nobody important was watching. A young executive walked past, deliberately dragging his muddy shoes across the freshly mopped floor. "Oops," he said with a smirk, not even bothering to look back. In the executive bathroom, James found himself scrubbing graffiti that mocked the cleaning staff. His hands shook slightly as he removed the cruel words, thinking about how many times other janitors had done the same task, swallowing their pride in silence. He took photos with his phone, adding them to his growing collection of evidence. That night turned particularly challenging when a group of senior managers had a late strategy meeting. James was cleaning the windows in the adjoining room when their conversation caught his attention. "Look," said one voice, "if we cut the maintenance budget by 30%, we could increase our department bonuses. These people should be grateful they even have jobs." The others laughed and someone added, "Right? And did you see that new guy? Looks like he's never seen a vacuum cleaner before." More laughter followed, along with detailed plans to reduce wages for the support staff while patting their own pockets. James pretended to be deeply focused on a stubborn window smudge, but his mind was racing. He'd suspected problems with company culture, but this was beyond toxic. It was systematic discrimination and bullying. He watched as they left their meeting room in complete disarray, tables covered in coffee cups and food wrappers, papers scattered everywhere. During his break, James sat alone in the maintenance room, writing detailed notes about everything he'd witnessed. Mr. Thompson, the supervisor, noticed his troubled expression. "Rough night, kid?" he asked kindly. James nodded, realizing that this man had probably seen countless workers come and go, all facing the same disrespect. Near the end of his shift, James encountered the cleaning staff's break room covered in trash. Someone had taped a crude note to the wall. "Maybe if you clean this up fast enough, you'll learn English better." His colleagues looked defeated, but continued their work without complaint. It took everything in him not to reveal his true identity right then. As dawn approached, James helped an elderly cleaner named Mrs. Wu with some heavy lifting. She had been at Sterling for 15 years and spoke softly about how things had gotten worse over time. "Before, people would at least say thank you," she said, her eyes distant. "Now they don't see us at all." Driving home that morning, James couldn't shake the heaviness in his chest. The second week had shown him something crucial. This wasn't just about a few bad apples or occasional rudeness. The company he was about to lead had developed a culture where treating people poorly had become normal. He spent hours at his kitchen table, reviewing his notes and photos. His wife brought him breakfast, concerned by the dark circles under his eyes. "You're doing the right thing," she said softly, squeezing his shoulder. James nodded, knowing that what would come next would shock everyone at Sterling Technologies. As he finally went to bed, James thought about Mrs. Wu and all the others who worked tirelessly despite the disrespect they faced. Soon, very soon, things would change. But first, he had to finish his mission and document every instance of this behavior. The reckoning that was coming would change more than just a few attitudes. It would transform the entire company. Night after night, the toxic atmosphere at Sterling Technologies became more apparent. James now moved through the building like a shadow, witnessing an endless stream of disrespect and cruelty. His small notebook was filling up with dates, times, and detailed accounts of everything he saw and heard. One particularly difficult evening, he was cleaning the executive floor when he overheard a heated conversation in the conference room. A group of senior managers were discussing upcoming budget cuts. "Why do we even provide benefits to the cleaning crew?" One voice sneered. "It's not like they contribute anything to the company's success." James's hand tightened around his broom as he listened. Through the crack in the door, he could see them lounging in expensive chairs, feet up on the polished table. "Speaking of which," another added with a laugh, "did you see that new janitor? Bet he doesn't even know how lucky he is to be here." The irony wasn't lost on James. In just a few days, he would be their boss, but right now, they saw him as nothing more than someone to mock. He continued his work, carefully documenting every word, every cruel joke, every dismissive comment. Later that night, James encountered Mrs. Wu again. She was struggling with a heavy trash bag that had split open, spilling contents across the floor. As he helped her clean up, she shared stories about her grandchildren, how she worked this job to help pay for their education. "They tell me to quit," she said softly, "but who will hire someone my age?" Around 2 a.m., the true colors of Sterling's corporate culture showed themselves again. A young executive stumbled out of his office, clearly having worked late. He walked straight through a wet floor sign, leaving footprints everywhere. When James moved to clean them, the executive turned around. "Hey, you missed a spot," he said, deliberately knocking over his coffee cup. "Better get that too." James cleaned up the mess in silence, but his mind was racing. He thought about his own parents, immigrants who had worked cleaning jobs to put him through school. They had faced the same kind of treatment, the same casual cruelty from people who thought their job made them less worthy of respect. During his break, James sat in the maintenance room, reviewing his notes from the past few days. The small space smelled of cleaning supplies and instant coffee, but it felt more honest than the expensive offices upstairs. Mr. Thompson walked in, looking tired. "You know," he said, settling into a worn chair, "I've been here 20 years. Never seen it this bad." As the night shifted toward morning, James witnessed what would become the final straw. A group of executives were having a late-night strategy session, and their voices carried through the ventilation system. They were plotting to outsource the entire maintenance department, laughing about how they could save money by hiring cheaper workers. "Who cares if they don't speak English?" one joked. "As long as they can hold 'em up." The laughter that followed made James's stomach turn. He recorded the entire conversation on his phone, adding it to his growing collection of evidence. Dawn was breaking as James finished his shift. He looked out over the city from a window he had just cleaned, thinking about all the other buildings, all the other invisible workers who faced the same treatment every day. In his pocket, his phone held enough evidence to change everything at Sterling Technologies. As he drove home, James thought about the week ahead. Soon, he would walk into this same building wearing a different uniform, carrying a different kind of authority. The same people who had dismissed him, mocked him, and treated him like he was nothing would soon learn a powerful lesson about respect and dignity. Back home, exhausted but determined, James began organizing his evidence. His wife brought him his favorite tea, watching as he sorted through photos, notes, and recordings. "Are you ready for what comes next?" she asked quietly. James nodded, thinking about Mrs. Wu, Mr. Thompson, and all the others who deserved better. The next phase of his plan would shock everyone at Sterling Technologies. But first, he needed to get some sleep. In just a few days, he would transform from the invisible janitor to the very visible CEO, and nothing at Sterling would ever be the same again. The breaking point at Sterling Technologies came sooner than James expected. On what was supposed to be one of his final nights as a janitor, he witnessed something that would change everything. The clock had just struck midnight when he heard loud voices coming from the main conference room. Inside, a group of senior executives were having what they called an emergency strategy meeting. James quietly pushed his cleaning cart past the door, which they had left slightly open. The scene inside made him freeze. They were reviewing personnel files of the maintenance staff, making cruel jokes about each person. "Look at this one," a voice said, holding up a file. "Been here 15 years and still can't write a proper report in English." The room erupted in laughter. James recognized the file. It belonged to Mrs. Wu. His hands tightened around the handle of his cart as he listened. Another executive chimed in, "Well, we won't have to worry about any of them much longer. I found a contractor who'll do all the cleaning for half what we're paying now. No benefits, no insurance, nothing." More laughter followed, along with the sound of high fives. James pretended to clean nearby, his heart pounding. He carefully positioned his phone to record their conversation. They were plotting not just to fire the maintenance staff, but to do it in a way that would deny them their rightful benefits. One executive even suggested doing it right before the holidays to save on end-of-year bonuses. The conversation got worse as the night went on. They moved from mocking the cleaning staff to making fun of other employees, customer service representatives, security guards, cafeteria workers. It seemed no one was safe from their cruel jokes and plans for budget cuts. "Hey, new guy," one of them suddenly called out, noticing James. "Since you're here, make yourself useful and clean up this mess." They had deliberately spilled coffee and scattered papers everywhere. James entered the room, keeping his head down, feeling their eyes on him as he cleaned. "See," one executive said loudly, "they don't even react. It's like they're robots or something." Another added, "Well, at least robots might understand simple instructions." Their laughter echoed through the empty building as James silently cleaned up their mess. What they didn't notice was how carefully James was observing everything. He saw which executives were leading the cruel behavior. He noted how they had confidential files spread across the table, breaking company policy. He recorded their plans to violate labor laws and discriminate against workers. After they finally left, James sat alone in the conference room, reviewing the recordings on his phone. The evidence was overwhelming, not just of cruelty, but of planned illegal actions. He thought about Mrs. Wu, about Mr. Thompson, about all the hard-working people whose lives these executives treated like jokes. Around 3 a.m., Rita from HR called his personal phone. "James," she said quietly, "I just got the emails. They're planning to start the layoffs next week, before you officially take over." James thanked her for the information, his mind already forming a plan. He spent the rest of his shift taking detailed notes and gathering more evidence. Every cruel comment, every planned violation, every moment of disrespect was documented. The sun was rising as he finished his last round of cleaning, knowing it would be his final night as a janitor. Driving home, James called his wife. "It's happening sooner than we planned," he said. "I can't wait another week." She understood immediately. She had seen how these nights had affected him, how each new story of cruelty and disrespect had built up inside him. At home, James spread everything out on his kitchen table: notes, photos, recordings, copies of emails. 2 weeks of evidence that would shock everyone at Sterling Technologies. He had seen the company's true face, and now it was time to show them his. Tomorrow wouldn't be another quiet night of cleaning. Tomorrow, James Chen would walk into Sterling Technologies as its new CEO, and every person who had shown their true character over the past 2 weeks would learn exactly who had been watching them. The morning of the transformation arrived with a mix of tension and purpose. James stood in front of his bathroom mirror, this time trading his janitor's uniform for a perfectly tailored suit. His wife helped him adjust his tie, noticing how different he looked from the man who had been coming home at dawn for the past 2 weeks. "Take care of Mrs. Wu and the others," she said softly. James nodded, thinking about all the faces who had become familiar during his nights of cleaning. He packed his briefcase with 2 weeks' worth of evidence, photos, recordings, and detailed notes that would change everything. Rita from HR met him in the parking garage at 8 a.m. "Everyone's gathered in the main conference room," she said, her voice tense. "They think it's just another meeting about the new CEO." James took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and headed for the surface elevator, the same one he used countless times as a janitor. The maintenance staff was starting their day shift when he passed through their break room. Mrs. Wu was there, sorting cleaning supplies. She gave him the same polite nod she always did, not recognizing him without the janitor's uniform. "Please stay for the meeting," he said quietly as he passed. She looked confused but nodded. James waited in a small office next to the conference room, listening to the buzz of conversations through the wall. The same executives who had mocked him nights ago were now eagerly discussing their plans for impressing the new CEO. They had no idea what was coming. At exactly 9 a.m., Rita called everyone to attention. The conference room was packed. Executives in expensive suits at the front, middle managers in the middle, and the maintenance staff standing nervously at the back. Some of the executives were already smirking at the cleaning staff's presence. "Before we begin," Rita announced, "I'd like to introduce our new CEO." The room fell silent with anticipation. James took one final deep breath and walked in, not through the main doors, but through the side entrance near where the maintenance staff stood. For a moment, nobody moved. Then recognition began to dawn on faces throughout the room. The young executive who had deliberately spilled coffee turned pale. The managers who had mocked the cleaning staff sat frozen in their chairs. Mrs. Wu's eyes widened as she realized why the new janitor's smile had seemed so familiar. "Good morning," James said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "Some of you know me as the new CEO. Others know me as the janitor who's been cleaning your offices for the past 2 weeks. He began setting up his laptop, connecting it to the projector. "Before we discuss the future of Sterling Technologies," he continued, "let's review some interesting moments from the past 2 weeks. The screen lit up with the first photo, the executive meeting where they had planned to fire the maintenance staff. For the next hour, James presented his evidence. Photos of deliberate messes, recordings of cruel conversations, documented plans to violate labor laws. With each new piece of evidence, the room grew more silent. Some executives stared at their hands, others tried to look defiant, but no one spoke. When he played the recording of them mocking Mrs. Wu's English, she stood straighter, lifting her chin with dignity. Mr. Thompson, watching from the back, allowed himself a small smile as he saw his tormentors squirm in their expensive chairs. "I came to Sterling Technologies to lead this company," James said, his voice firm but calm. "But before I could lead, I needed to understand. What I found was a culture of disrespect, cruelty, and planned discrimination. That ends today." He turned to face the executives who had been the worst offenders. "Some of you are probably wondering if you'll have jobs after this meeting." The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. James looked each one in the eye, remembering every cruel word, every deliberate act of disrespect they had shown. The next words he would speak would change Sterling Technologies forever. The company's true transformation was about to begin, and everyone in that room knew nothing would ever be the same. The tension in the conference room was thick enough to cut with a knife as James stood before his assembled employees. The projector still showed evidence of the past 2 weeks, images and recordings that had exposed the ugly truth about Sterling Technologies' culture. "Let me be absolutely clear," James began, his voice steady and strong. "The behavior I witnessed cannot and will not continue at this company." He picked up a stack of papers from his briefcase. "In my hands, I hold termination notices for 32 employees, effective immediately." The room erupted in whispers and nervous shuffling. One of the senior executives stood up, straightening his expensive tie. "You can't do this," he declared. "We have contracts. We have rights." James simply clicked to the next slide, a recording of that same executive planning illegal layoffs of maintenance staff. "Speaking of rights," James replied calmly, "let's discuss the labor laws you were planning to violate. Or perhaps we should talk about workplace discrimination." The executive slowly sank back into his chair, his face ashen. James walked around the room, handing out termination notices one by one. Each recipient had been carefully documented in his 2 weeks of observation. The young manager who had deliberately spilled coffee, the executives who had planned discriminatory layoffs, the supervisors who had encouraged bullying. Some tried to argue to defend themselves, but James had evidence for every termination. Photos, recordings, witness statements, 2 weeks of meticulous documentation that left no room for denial. As each person received their notice, security personnel quietly appeared to escort them from the building. Mrs. Wu watched from the back of the room, tears in her eyes, as the people who had mocked her for years were led out. Mr. Thompson stood beside her, his usual tired expression replaced with one of quiet satisfaction. Once the last terminated employee had been escorted out, James turned to the remaining staff. "Now," he said, his voice softening slightly, "let's talk about the future of Sterling Technologies." He clicked to a new slide, showing a completely reorganized company structure. "From this moment forward, every employee at Sterling Technologies will be treated with respect, dignity, and fairness. This isn't just a nice idea, it's a requirement for continued employment." He outlined new policies, including a zero-tolerance approach to workplace bullying and discrimination. James then did something that surprised everyone. He began highlighting the maintenance staff's contributions to the company. He showed calculations of how much money they saved through their careful handling of equipment, their attention to detail, their dedication to keeping the building in perfect condition. "Mrs. Wu," he called out, causing her to jump slightly. "Would you please come forward?" She walked to the front of the room, nervous but holding her head high. "For 15 years, James announced, Mrs. Wu has worked harder than anyone in this building. Today, I'm appointing her as our new head of facilities management." The announcement was met with applause, genuine this time, not the nervous kind from earlier. Mrs. Wu's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different from before. James continued with more promotions and role changes, each one carefully considered to reward those who had shown true character and work ethic. As the meeting drew to a close, James made one final announcement. "Starting next week, every executive in this company will spend 1 day each month working alongside our maintenance staff, our customer service team, and our security personnel. Understanding and respect come from experience." The room buzzed with a new kind of energy as people filed out. Hope had replaced fear. Respect had replaced arrogance. Those who remained knew that this was more than just a change in leadership, it was a complete transformation of their company's soul. Back in his new office, the same one he had cleaned just days ago, James looked out over the city. The morning's events had been dramatic but necessary. Sterling Technologies was about to become a very different company, and its true transformation was just beginning. The news of what happened at Sterling Technologies spread quickly through the building. By lunchtime, the entire company was buzzing with stories about the janitor who turned out to be the CEO and how he had fired the most powerful executives for their cruel behavior. James spent the afternoon in meetings with the remaining staff, outlining his vision for the company's future. The same conference room that had once echoed with mocking laughter now had discussions about respect, dignity, and fair treatment for all employees. "I want to show you something," James said to the department heads gathered around the table. He pulled out his small notebook, worn from 2 weeks of late-night observations. "In here, I also wrote down acts of kindness I witnessed, small moments that showed true character." He read from his notes. A middle manager who always cleaned up her own coffee spills. A junior executive who learned basic Chinese phrases to greet Mrs. Wu each morning. A team leader who stayed late to help the cleaning staff during a particularly busy night. "These are the people who will help rebuild Sterling Technologies," James explained. "Not because of their fancy degrees or impressive titles, but because they understand that every person deserves respect." Later that afternoon, James visited the maintenance department's break room. The atmosphere had completely changed. People who had once been afraid to make eye contact now stood tall, talking and laughing freely. Mrs. Wu was already organizing her new team, her natural leadership abilities shining through. "Mr. Chen," she said, approaching him with a small group of workers, "we wanted to thank you, not just for the changes, but for showing everyone that we matter." James noticed she was wearing a new badge that read Facilities Management Director, and her pride was evident. The day brought more surprises for the remaining employees. James announced new company policies that shocked everyone. Equal benefits for all staff levels. A clear path for advancement based on merit, not office politics. Regular town halls where any employee could speak directly to management. But the biggest surprise came when James revealed the new company structure. The traditional pyramid of power had been flattened. Executives would now report regularly to frontline workers about how they were improving working conditions. Every decision would consider its impact on all staff levels. "Remember," James told them, "I learned more about this company in 2 weeks as a janitor than I could have in a year as CEO. That's why our new management training will start from the ground up." He explained how every new manager would spend their first month working in support roles. By late afternoon, James received an unexpected visit from Mr. Thompson, the maintenance supervisor. The older man stood in the doorway of the CEO's office, looking emotional. "In 20 years," he said, his voice rough, "I never thought I'd see anything like this." James invited him in, pouring him a cup of coffee, the same brand they kept in the maintenance break room. They talked about the years Mr. Thompson had spent watching good people being mistreated, feeling powerless to help them. "You're not powerless anymore," James assured him. "In fact, I'd like you to head our new employee relations department. Nobody knows the heart of this company better than you do." Mr. Thompson wiped his eyes, nodding gratefully. As the day drew to a close, James walked through the building one last time, not as a janitor or as a CEO, but as someone who had seen the company from both perspectives. He noticed small changes already, people holding doors for each other, cleaning up their own messes, saying thank you to the maintenance staff. In the lobby, he paused to help a cleaner move some heavy equipment, just as he had done many times in the past 2 weeks. The young worker didn't recognize him at first, then did a double take. James just smiled and kept helping. Some habits, he decided, were worth keeping, no matter what position you held. The next few weeks at Sterling Technologies brought dramatic changes that surprised everyone. The atmosphere in the building had completely transformed. From the ground floor to the executive suites, a new spirit of respect and cooperation filled the air. One morning, employees arrived to find the executive dining room's doors wide open. Inside, the fancy coffee machines and special catering service had been moved to the main cafeteria. "From now on," James announced, "we all eat together." The sight of executives and maintenance staff sharing lunch tables became the new normal. Mrs. Wu's first week as Facilities Management Director showed why James had chosen her. She knew every corner of the building, every procedure, and most importantly, every person. When she held her first department meeting, even former executives listened carefully to her ideas for improving building operations. The company's transformation caught media attention. Business magazines wanted to interview James about his undercover mission, but he declined. "This isn't about me," he told his assistant. "It's about changing how we treat people." Instead, he encouraged reporters to interview the maintenance staff and other employees about the changes. One particularly meaningful change came when James converted the old executive gym into a daycare center. "Many of our cleaning staff are working parents," he explained during the opening ceremony. "They've been paying for expensive daycare or struggling with difficult schedules. Not anymore." Mr. Thompson thrived in his new role heading employee relations. His office became a place where workers from all levels felt comfortable sharing their concerns. "For the first time," he told James, "people believe someone is actually listening to them." The Walk in Their Shoes program became mandatory for all managers. Each month, they worked different jobs throughout the company. The former executive who had once mocked the maintenance staff now spent a day cleaning floors. By day's end, his respect for the work had completely changed. James kept his own connection to the maintenance team. Every Friday night, he would put on work clothes and help with cleaning rounds. "A good leader never forgets what it's like to do the hard work," he told anyone who questioned this practice. The company's performance began to improve too. With happy employees came better productivity. Customer satisfaction scores rose as workers at all levels took pride in their jobs. The toxic culture that had driven away talent was replaced by one that attracted the best people. One day, a young cleaning staff member stopped James in the hallway. "Sir," she said nervously, "I wanted to thank you. I just got accepted into the company's new education program." The program, which paid for employees to continue their education, was another of James's changes. The fired executives tried to fight back, hiring lawyers and threatening lawsuits. But James's careful documentation of their behavior, combined with support from the entire workforce, made their threats empty. Some even eventually apologized, admitting they had been wrong. Mrs. Wu's grandson visited the company one day after school. He watched proudly as his grandmother led a meeting with department heads, speaking confidently about facilities improvements. "My grandson used to be embarrassed to say his grandmother was a cleaner," she told James later. "Now he tells everyone she's a director." The biggest surprise came when other companies began asking Sterling Technologies for advice on improving their workplace culture. James developed a simple response. "Treat everyone with respect, from the CEO to the newest cleaner. Success follows when people feel valued." As the weeks turned into months, the changes became permanent. The old culture of disrespect and cruelty felt like a distant memory. In its place was something new. A company where every person, regardless of their job, was treated with dignity and respect. 6 months after James's undercover mission, Sterling Technologies had become a different company entirely. The building itself seemed brighter somehow, filled with the energy of people who genuinely enjoyed coming to work each day. On a sunny morning, James stood in the lobby watching employees arrive. The security guard greeted everyone by name. Executives carrying coffee cups chatted with maintenance staff, while Mrs. Wu discussed building improvements with her team. The divisions that had once separated people had disappeared. The company's success had exceeded everyone's expectations. Employee turnover dropped to nearly zero. Job applications flooded in as word spread about Sterling's amazing work culture. Even their competitors had to admit that something special was happening. That morning, James had called an all-hands meeting, but this time there was no tension in the air. The same conference room that had once witnessed the dramatic firing of toxic executives was now filled with happy, engaged employees from all departments. 6 months ago, James began, looking around the room. "I walked into this building as a janitor. Today, I want to share some numbers with you." He clicked through slides showing incredible improvements, productivity up 50%, customer satisfaction at record highs, and employee happiness scores that topped their industry. But the most touching moment came when Mrs. Wu took the stage. Her English wasn't perfect, but her leadership was clear as she presented her department's achievements. The room burst into genuine applause, not the polite kind from before, but real appreciation for her hard work. Mr. Thompson shared stories about how the Employee Relations Department had resolved conflicts through understanding and respect, not power and fear. "We don't just solve problems anymore," he said, smiling. "We prevent them by treating each other like family." The education program had already helped 30 employees start college courses. The daycare center was full of children whose parents could now work without worry. The cafeteria had become a place where job titles didn't matter. Only conversations and connections did. James introduced a new initiative, the Sterling Scholarship. Every year, children of maintenance and support staff would receive full college scholarships. Mrs. Wu's grandson would be among the first recipients, planning to study business management like the CEO who had changed his grandmother's life. The Walk in Their Shoes program had become famous in the business world. Other companies sent their executives to learn from Sterling's example. They would spend a day working alongside the maintenance staff, learning the same lesson James had learned, that every job deserved respect. Near the end of the meeting, James shared a final surprise. The company's success meant bigger bonuses, but this time they would be shared equally among all employees. The maintenance staff would receive the same amounts as executives, a first in corporate history. As the meeting ended, James noticed a small group of employees gathering around Mrs. Wu. They were from different departments, different backgrounds, different levels of the company. But they were laughing together, planning a company picnic, acting like old friends. Outside his office, James had kept the janitor's uniform hanging in a glass case. Under it was a simple quote, "True character is revealed not in how we treat our equals, but in how we treat those we once thought weren't." The story of Sterling Technologies spread far beyond the company itself. It became a case study in business schools, an example of how treating people with dignity could transform not just a workplace, but an entire industry. Other companies began to follow their lead, creating their own versions of respectful, inclusive cultures. As James looked out over the city from his office that evening, he smiled, remembering those nights pushing a cleaning cart through dark hallways. Sometimes the best view of a company wasn't from the top down, but from the ground up. And sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one in the expensive suit, but the one with the courage to see and change the truth.